There are many perspectives or opening quotes, and we took one from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, which I think is particularly apt. That in order to, we say on Passover in every generation that the Jewish people are attacked and persecuted. And as Rabbi Sachs has said, you always need to have a justification. And it has to be based on the highest authority in the culture at any given age. He talks about the Middle Ages, and the church is playing that role. And he has some other historical examples, which were too many for this opening presentation. But he talks about how the church has been surpassed. It was science in the 20th century, the 19th and 20th century. And then it became that after Hiroshima and the Holocaust, the science was no longer the embodiment of the highest moral authority. And then human rights became that. The 21st century, as Professor Kotler has said, is the civil, secular religion of the 21st century. So that the assault on Jewish life, on Jews and on Judaism and the Jewish state, is now cast in the language of human rights. And that is the principle which Ann and I are going to present to you, how it became so commonplace to use these kinds of allegations in order to attack Israel and the Jewish people. David Mattes, when he spoke, talked about the Durban conference, and he's one of the survivors. Erwin Kotler was there, and perhaps some of the others were there also. It was, Dina, by the way, we are going to do in the Knesset on June 20th a not quite 15-year conference on the impact of Durban. And I have to say that at the time, almost nobody in the Israeli government paid any attention to this in any serious way. An anti-Semitic conference done in the name of human rights under the auspices of the then Commission on Human Rights in the United Nations. This is the language that was adopted in the final declaration. And you'll see how many times the language of apartheid is repeated. Apartheid, apartheid, racist crimes, war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing. That's the basis for BDS. That is the, if you want, the principal basis for BDS, for demonization, for lawfare, for the assault on the legitimacy and the singling out of Israel. By using the language of war crimes, by talking about genocide, racism, there you can hang that onto specific United Nations declarations, to specific aspects of international law and other frameworks, the International Criminal Court that exists. This is the basis, and it was not done, as David said, this was not done something that was suddenly produced. It was created over a period of time at the Tehran Preparatory Conference before that, but also, in fact, in our paper, and I don't think you'll have time too much to talk about this, but how it goes all the way back to the Soviet anti-Semitism and later on to the Zionism is Racism Resolution of 1975 and other landmarks along the way. These were all using that framework of international law, and it became full-blown at Durban. Now, what I want to spend a few minutes talking about is the industry. There's a lot of money behind this, and that money produces a large number of people involved in this industry. There are a lot of jobs involved in it. A lot of it is involved, in Geneva, you see it all the time in terms of the Human Rights Council and the permanent civil servants that are continuing to push this agenda. But a large amount of money comes from the Western democratic human rights world, from European governments. We estimate that there are tens of millions of euros, pounds, Swiss francs, kroner every year throughout Europe going into this industry or this machine. And I'll give you some examples of this just to show you. At about $5 million a year, it's roughly a little bit more than that in euros now, 4 governments, Switzerland, Holland, Denmark, and Sweden, $5 million a year, give money to about 40 to 50 different organizations, almost all of which are part of this whole industry, that appear in the United Nations, that issue reports and statements, that present, and just yesterday, the Palestine Center for Human Rights presented yet another volume of allegations of war crimes to the International Criminal Court. Al-Haq, one after the other, constantly in a rolling stream. This is a very powerful machine with a lot of money, and the amounts are hundreds of thousands of dollars a year to these organizations who exist primarily to promote propaganda against Israel through the language of human rights. The Palestine Center for Human Rights, or Al-Haq, which means the law, All of these are not focusing on human rights within the Palestinian Authority and the abuse of human rights. They're focusing on using these as a weapon against Israel. Just again, I'm going to give you just some very prominent examples. Alvin, you talked about that. I know Aaron was also at the conference in Berlin. It would have been good to talk about the German government's own role in this process. Here's one example. There was a conference that took place in June, was it 2014, I believe. It was 10 years since the International Criminal Court's, the International Court of Justice's recommendation, advisory decision, which was the whole thing, but was one continuous abuse of the language of human rights and the language of international law. I won't go through the history, but two humanitarian organizations, the two largest, wealthiest humanitarian aid organizations in Germany, both of which are largely funded by the government. Protestants and Catholics, we're very ecumenical here, ran a completely one-sided conference, completely distorting both the history of the separation matter, but also there was nobody there speaking about the minority opinion by Judge Bergenthal, by anybody else, completely presenting this, not even mentioning that this was an advisory opinion, a political process. This was presented in a conference in Berlin, very widely advertised. That's very much part of the process. And none of these events are individual. They are not, none of them are one-shots. These are this kind of language is constantly being repeated by this industry. In Switzerland recently, last year, 2 weeks, again, church-related, in a main church in Zurich, the Israeli group fringe organization, roughly 10 people, very much committed to their messianism, breaking the silence, presented day after day. They had a permanent photo exhibit for 2 weeks, and every day there was, I'm down to 2 minutes, almost there. They've traveled to approximately 65 places in the last 2 years that we've tracked this. All of this is supported by European funding. I won't show the videos. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, the main international human rights organizations, going back to the late 60s for Amnesty, the 70s for Human Rights Watch, which started off as Helsinki Watch, have become very involved in the campaign to bring in the International Criminal Court. And the language of human rights, the language of international law is constantly repeated. We looked at all of the pages that they had printed on Israel using that language, comparing with all the other countries in the Middle East. And in each case, Israel sticks up, I could say like a sore thumb, but it's worse than that. Far more than most of the, certainly Syria, Iraq, all the other countries. This is part of that machine, and they got Human Rights Watch from George Soros, $60 to $70 million a year, and the Amnesty has a large amount, also a large budget for this. Ken Roth has got dozens of tweets, and his Twitter feed seems like it's being run, I shouldn't say this because it's being recorded by a robot. If you look at it, there's constantly, but the extra hostility towards Israel and the use of the language of, again, international law and the constant pressure for bringing Israel before the International Criminal Court is very much part of it. The use of very fancy technology with no substance. Amnesty International launched something called Gaza Forensics. Again, I don't have time to show you all the details. It was basically like watching, and they used the language of CSI, a television program. There was no substance, but it was a lot of flash, and all of the claims were war crimes in Gaza by Israel in 2014. All these are double standards. These are things which other speakers have mentioned, and Ann will go into more details of that. But these NGOs and this machine feed this process. So the reports that are issued by the Commission of Inquiry reports that are issued by the same UN Human Rights Council, the infamous Goldstone report, which at least he had the integrity to withdraw or to denounce his own report. Minor language, we won't go into it now. Then the Shabas Davis report that came out last year, all of which are basically built on the allegations by these same NGOs. I won't talk about the medical aspects of this, but you see the same thing in that field. The way I think that the most important aspect of this is to demand that these organizations, in any framework that uses the language of international law, use it in a consistent and professional way by exposing the inconsistencies and the abuse of that language, I think we've made some progress, at least in forcing them on the defensive to justify or to fail to justify the way in which they single out Israel and use this in a very political way. I guess you're the next slide, right?
Yeah.
Okay, you're good.
Just as I give my presentation, you'll see just examples of imagery from NGO websites and some of these international legal frameworks dealing with Israel. And before I start, these are, the two images are from a Palestinian NGO called Badil that emphasizes the right of return. These are images that have been posted on their website. This is a NGO that gets millions of dollars from European governments and churches. And the bottom is a conference that took place a couple years ago talking about why Israel was an apartheid colonial entity that needed to be erased in its entirety. Again, a conference funded by European taxpayer dollars. Since Israel's founding, international legal and human rights rhetoric has been the prominent discourse used to attack the Jewish state. Today, BDS campaigns, divestment initiatives, the blocking of export licenses, labeling, and other initiatives, threats of prosecution of individuals and companies doing business in Israel, all claim to be based on the imperative of international law. There are three ways in which the rhetoric of international law and international legal frameworks are used to demonize Israel, undermine or cancel Jewish self-determination rights, and serve as a new form of anti-Semitism. The first method is to promote the idea that the very existence of a Jewish state is illegal and a violation of international norms. So we see this in the Zionism is racism canard, the so-called right of return, and claims that Israel is a racist, colonial, and apartheid entity. Prior to the passage of the Zionism is racism resolution in 1975, during the 1960s and 70s even, the Arab states in conjunction with the Soviet Union and the PLO sought to have Zionism included as a form of racism in the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and in the Convention to Suppress the Crime Against Apartheid. They were also used as a basis to have Israel expelled from the UN in the early 70s and have it replaced by the PLO. Today we have Israel Apartheid Week, propaganda issued by the PLO's Negotiation Support Unit, again funded by the British and Norwegian governments, and European and government and church NGOs, as Gerald was talking about, that publish imagery such as this, promoting these themes, hosting government-sponsored pseudo-academic conferences, and reports arguing that Israel must cease to exist in its entirety. They strategize plans for, and currently are working on a new case before the International Court of Justice to have Israel declared guilty of colonialism, racism, and apartheid, and therefore an illegal entity. The second method merges claims of international legal violations with classical anti-Semitism. So we see this manifested in Christmas paraphernalia issued by various NGOs, events like the Bethlehem Unwrapped in the UK last Christmas, Christ at the Checkpoint Conference, and statements expressing extreme hostility for Jews, such as during the 2006 Lebanon War, when Ken Roth condemned Israel's actions as an eye for an eye, or more accurately in this case, 20 eyes for an eye. This may have been the morality of some more primitive moment, but it is not the morality of international humanitarian law. The third approach accuses Israel of being the singular violator of international law in contrast to all other countries. This phenomenon can be more overt, such as comparing Israeli actions to that of the Nazis. And so during the 2014 Gaza war, many officials from Human Rights Watch, including Ken Roth and several others in their European desk, were writing on Twitter, "Never again," while retweeting a propagandistic ad placed in the New York Times and The Guardian by the International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, signed by 300 alleged children of Holocaust survivors, equating the Nazi genocide to the massacre of Palestinians in Gaza. Sarah Lee Whitson, Human Rights Watch's Mideast director, tweeted in response to an exhibit at the U.S. Holocaust Museum on Syria that the museum should also show pictures of the death and destruction in Gaza. And members of the Goldstone Commission in 2009 asked officials of a Gaza NGO at their public hearings to theorize on the uniqueness of Israeli pathology. And that part of that exchange is up there. And the officials from the NGO responding that Israel acted the way it did because the IDF and Israelis identify with Nazis. This third approach, however, is often more subtle, operating by promoting double standards, disproportionate focus, and hearkening to classical anti-Semitic canards. It involves micro-scrutiny and obsessive focus on Israeli actions during armed conflict. It uses sui generis interpretations of international law to single out the Jewish state. NGOs like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch issue reports and statements and execute sophisticated PR campaigns in many orders of magnitude, as we have seen in comparison to other conflicts. Entire programs, often again managed by church groups, such as the International Humanitarian Law website run by the Swedish church group Diakonia, and even the Harvard School of Public Health, are aimed at cataloging uniquely Israeli violations of the law, where they issue research reports, conferences, and hold webinars for legal and humanitarian professionals. Descriptions of country work in the region by humanitarian aid organizations emphasize, again, Israel's alleged illegal activity, in marked contrast to how other conflict zones are described. The IHL Secretariat, again mentioned by Gerald, to dozens of NGOs, they issue publications, videos, conferences, hold side events at the UN, purporting to document Israeli malice. And these reports would then become the basis of UN reports and lobbying in European parliaments in order to have sanctions imposed on Israel. Conferences funded by Oxfam and the European Union are held strategizing on how we can prosecute Israeli war criminals, and this took place in Cairo and was live streamed on Al Jazeera. Groups like Breaking the Silence are feted as heroes and celebrities traveling the globe telling lurid tales of the immoral IDF, something no other country would countenance or fund. European governments give B'Tselem hundreds of thousands of dollars for a camera project where Palestinians stand at the ready to film every IDF infraction, but these filmmakers never happen to be around when acts of Palestinian terrorism and violence are taking place. Without exception, and aside from a very few token and general condemnations of Palestinian actions, these campaigns present Israel as completely flouting international legal obligations, branding every action taken by Israel to be illegal, and promote a so-called right to resistance and erase the context of terrorism, to such extreme extent that the International Court of Justice advisory opinion in 2004 on the security barrier actually found that Israel alone does not have the right to self-defense under international law. It declared that right, exercise of that right, to be illegal. Even efforts to prevent civilian casualties, such as the issuing of warnings in Gaza before strikes, at extreme loss of strategic advantage to the IDF, and that other military officials from around the world have noted go way above and beyond the requirements of law, are condemned and used as further proof of Israeli malice and war crimes. The high contracting parties of the Geneva Conventions have held meetings to condemn state action only 3 times in history. Each of those 3 times were focusing on Israeli actions in Gaza and in the West Bank. The international community, again thanks to the joint efforts of the Arab League, the PLO, and human rights NGOs, were able to get Palestine admitted as a member to the International Criminal Court in violation of all of the treaty rules applicable, in order again to prosecute Israeli officials for war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. We heard a lot about examples at the UN, and 2 others I just want to mention. In April, Israel is going to be reviewed for its compliance under the Convention Against Torture. And unlike every other country, I've reviewed what they're going to be talking about, and countries such as Saudi Arabia and the Philippines are up for review along with Israel. Israel is going to be reviewed whether healthcare in Gaza and house demolitions are a form of torture under the treaty. Unlike every other country where how you're treated when you're imprisoned is going to be discussed. Another example, last year NGOs tried to lobby the Secretary General to have Israel included in a special list of extreme violators of child rights in armed conflict. The other people on this list, ISIS, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban. No other states are on this list, and they tried to get Israel alone inserted on this list. I don't even believe Hamas is on that list. While the international community laments the failure of European counter-terror operations in preventing the atrocities in Paris and Brussels, Israeli efforts to prevent stabbings, suicide bombings, shootings, car rammings are deemed disproportionate force. While Sweden's police shot a sword-wielding assailant at a Swedish school, Sweden's foreign minister, Margot Wallström, accused Israel of committing extrajudicial executions when doing the same thing in Jerusalem. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said that Palestinian terrorism is understandable because it is human nature to react to occupation. Campaigns accusing Israel of war crimes emphasize Palestinian child deaths and issues relating to water, hearkening medieval blood libels, and poisoning the wells. In the 2014 Gaza war, B'Tselem initiated a campaign called Families Bombed at Home, involving emotive counts and sophisticated interactive graphics, which you can see here, where you clicked on the house, and up would pop a list of all the people that allegedly were killed at the hands of Israeli airstrikes. They're aimed at portraying the IDF as brutal killers, deliberately targeting civilians. The campaign, however, erased the details of Palestinian combatant activity and branded fighters as civilians to magnify Israel's evil. The graphics and themes were adopted by many other NGOs and were a central focus of the UN Davis report. The Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, which you can see here, issued its own graphics to echo that of B'Tselem, so that Israel's evil could be graphically illustrated for the world to see. And again, Amnesty's Gaza platform that was purporting to document every Israeli airstrike to be used as evidence in international prosecutions, whereas all Palestinian activity was completely scrubbed from this application. So these are just a few of the thousands of examples of how the rhetoric of international law has become the language of the new anti-Semitism. And these campaigns and activities must continue to be systematically documented and exposed to push back against this new form of Jew hatred.